About a month ago, I watched The Arrangement, one of Elia Kazan's later films, and it blew my mind. As soon as it finished, I knew I needed to check out some of Kazan's other films from the 1960s. And that brings us to Splendor in the Grass, which is probably his most famous film of that decade. He only made 4 in the 60s, with his most famous work having been done in the 50s. I've seen 3 of these 1960s movies, and at a glance, I would say that this movie is better than Wild River, which is not bad, but it's worse than The Arrangement, or at least it's a lot less interesting. This video probably won't be as long as my video about The Arrangement, but this is a good movie, and there are some things to talk about, like how it fits in America in 1961, even though it was set in 1928, how it moves on from some of the hallmarks of the 50s, how it tries to balance some of the moralistic aspects, how the characters take on different dimensions. Overall, Splendor in the Grass is a fairly mature movie, and I like mature movies. This has a lot of life in it, and it's a compelling movie. On the other hand, it probably does get bogged down a little bit. The plot is defined by rigidity, I would say, by the rigidity of the times, the rigidity of the society, which I think to me was a little bit tiresome, maybe. Like I said, Splendor in the Grass is set in 1928. It's set in Kansas. The movie opens up with a huge waterfall, reminiscent of Niagara Falls, but it isn't Niagara Falls because the movie's set in Kansas. But the movie was actually filmed mainly in New York, but not at Niagara Falls. Elia Kazan was born in Istanbul, then known as Constantinople, and then part of the Ottoman Empire. His family moved to New York when he was 3. Kazan went to Williams and then to Yale. He was a Northeastern kid, I guess, but he would go on to make quite a few movies set in the South. His interest in the South may have been seeded in the 1930s when he traveled to Tennessee as part of the Communist Party. Hard to know exactly why he was so interested in it. This might not be the most subtle portrait of the South. You'll have to see what kind of ethnography you think this is, and why Kazan chose to set the film where he did. At one point, Warren Beatty's character, Bud, reveals that he has never had pizza. In fact, he doesn't know what pizza is. This suggests a certain vision of American adolescence that is totally at odds with Kazan's own experience. In The Arrangement and America, America, Kazan is totally tied up in his history as an immigrant, and a history of America as a country of immigrants. But in his Southern films, it's a different story. This is maybe only hinted at. Fortunately, the character Angelina is around to introduce Bud to pizza. Does Kazan see himself in this character? Is this whole movie part of a story of assimilation? Or is Kazan coming to the South as a critic, trying to lampoon it? Or just landing there in search of the crux of American traditionalism? Maybe that's what he wants to say something about. I'm not entirely sure. This waterfall that opens up the movie alludes to the enormous energy of the teenagers at the center of the story. Warren Beatty, like I said, plays Bud, the captain of the football team and son of an emerging oil tycoon. Beatty was so young when he made this movie that apparently in the trailer for it, the announcer mispronounces his name as Beatty. Natalie Wood plays his sweetheart, Wilma Dean. That's a very Southern name. There's so much trivia about Natalie Wood, some of it very grim, that I won't let myself get sidetracked by it, except one tiny thing, which I'll save for the end. This movie opens up with them making out in front of this waterfall, in their car, of course. And it seems like they want to go further, but they stop themselves in the name of all that is good and pure, or something like that. And Bud takes Wilma home. This is the story about teenage love between two people in their early 20s. Maybe if you squint, they might look like they could be in high school. In some ways, Splendor in the Grass really pushed the limits in terms of sexuality on screen. It's a lot more explicit than most of what you would find in the 50s or the 40s, really anytime, except for the pre-code era. And I think it has some of the more authentic and compelling romantic scenes in it. There's sparks here. Some of the more compelling romance you could find at the time. That said, the movie is really defined by what doesn't happen. From the beginning, it's clear that Bud and Deanie, as she is called, are trying to balance the elemental power of young romance with certain social and cultural norms and obligations. This turns out to be difficult, and that's the movie. Now, it's interesting that this movie came out in 1961 and is about seniors in high school, what we would today describe as teenagers, what I may have already referred to by accident as teenagers. It's not clear that they always would have been known that way. Today, it might seem like being a teenager is your fundamental right as a human, like it's something that everybody from the beginning of time has done. But in fact, in some ways, teenagers were an invention. There was a time before they existed. Don't believe me? Go try to find one in a movie from the 1940s. One of my favorite counterexamples is the great film, The Best Years of Our Lives, William Wyler. Frederick March has two kids. Technically, I think they're both teenagers, but one of them, played by Teresa Wright, is an adult. She drives around. She's got a car, very mature. And the other one, known only as Fred, is a kid who disappears for half the movie. He's a Boy Scout, you know? When people talk about Rebel Without a Cause, also starring Natalie Wood, as the cinematic birth of the teenager, they aren't exaggerating. Of course, there was more than one movie in that story, but it is kind of wild to think about how there was a time before there were teenagers in movies, and also before there were teenagers in real life, too. Kind of wild. Splendor in the Grass came out 6 years after Rebel Without a Cause. By then, I think the teenager would have been fairly rooted in American culture. I guess we weren't quite to the counterculture yet, though. Of course, this movie does not take place in 1961. It's set in 1928, which is long before James Dean had given his coat to anyone. James Dean would have been 3 years old at the time. So is this a movie about teenagers or not? Well, sort of, I think it is. Other than their somewhat corny accents, Bud and Deanie look like they could fit in at Dawson High School with Jim Stark. That's Rebel Without a Cause. Despite that movie being set almost 30 years later and in a completely different part of the country, this might be a drawback of the film. I'm not sure how rigorous the history and regionalism in this movie really is. Bud and Deanie do possess a sort of traditional Southern restraint, though. At least that's part of the plot. They don't go to any chicky runs. They try to please their families. So maybe they aren't teenagers. Really, in this movie, I think they aren't exactly teenagers, but the movie does seem to put its finger on some of the same conflict and anxiety, I guess, that you would find in other movies like Rebel Without a Cause. So in some ways, maybe although there aren't many teenagers in this movie, it is a movie about teenagers. Maybe it gives us the question that teenagers would be the answer to. One interesting thing about that reading, though, is that some fans of Rebel Without a Cause would tell you that it's really a movie about cars, and that teenagers could only exist with the help of the car, and that that's one of the themes of that movie. The car, which gave them independence and agency in the most American way possible. Well, in this movie, Bud has a car, and his dad works in the oil industry. So we have early signs of some kind of industrialism. But if we have cars, then shouldn't we have teenagers too? So maybe it's not quite that simple. I don't know. Another angle is that Jim's parents in Rebel Without a Cause would have been born around the same time as Bud and Deanie. So maybe it's a generational story. Maybe it's a story of the people that Bud and Deanie will grow up to be. But I don't quite buy that either. So in truth, I don't think the movie is making any super precise claims here, but it's telling a story of intergenerational conflict, which is pulling from a number of different contexts. And I think in some ways, it is a slightly anachronistic story of teenagers in 1961. And in other ways, maybe it is a story about American traditionalism prior to the teenager. Maybe those things aren't really that different. Who knows? Now, if the 20s was too early for teenagers, the decade did have its own kind of rebel. Everybody, say it with me. That's right. It's the flapper. And this movie has a flapper in it, Bud's sister, Virginia, who's a misfit in Kansas and a very interesting character. Virginia is a good example of how a lot of characters in this movie are well balanced. In some ways, Virginia is a vibe because she's liberated. She doesn't really care about provincialism in Kansas, about the harsh words of her father. At the same time, you can tell that being there is hard for her, and she flies pretty close to the sun, in truth, drinking and carrying on in a way that even the most liberated people might have to admit is unwise. There are a couple of beautiful moments of sincerity between Bud and Virginia, but mostly she's troubled, I guess. She's teetering between freedom and self-destruction. She's trying to cope with an unforgiving society, an unempathetic society. Ultimately, her story makes Bud and Deanie's balancing act a lot harder. Virginia is a very interesting character, and this is a fairly subtle plot device, seeing how Virginia's struggles influence Deanie. It's interesting. Virginia does basically disappear from the second half of the movie, which is a bit odd. The parents on either side of the story are also interesting characters that, again, kind of drive the plot in interesting ways. Deanie's mother is loving but kind of foolish. Bud's father is the loudest voice in the film. His character is maybe more dynamic than you would first think. Anyway, I'm not going to dive too deep into these parts, but hopefully it comes across that the mechanics of this movie are kind of cool. First of all, the conflicts are almost entirely internal. There are no car chases in this movie, just people attempting to do what they think is best. Imperfect people attempting to do what they think at best. Having said all that, this movie is kind of stodgy. Like I said at the beginning, it hinges on some cultural axioms that are kind of uninteresting. And you may find yourself sitting watching the movie thinking, okay, can't you guys just sit down and communicate directly with each other and your problems would disappear, right? Or can't you just ignore certain provincial things that are clearly so dated and then it might just disappear? I don't think that the movie does a good enough job at giving an intuitive, empathetic force to the social norms of the day. And so, like I said, you watch the movie today and you just think, well, just break the rules. Come on. What's the problem? All of your problems will just disappear, right? In a better movie, I think maybe we'd see exactly what those things mean, why the norms are there, why they're important, why people are compelled to follow them. I think this movie gets a little bit more naturalistic as it goes on. It starts with a fairly conspicuous score, but later we get a lot of silence, or a bit of ominous jazz music, some of which is a bit like what you find in the arrangement. There's one deep similarity between the structures of these two movies, which is that once the seed of conflict has been planted, there's really no going back. Once the train is off the tracks, it's never going to get back on them. And everything we do, all the struggles we make, will really just take us farther from where we started. This is compelling, but in the arrangement, it's way more extreme. This may be a more traditional tearjerker with a compelling relationship at the center of it, but I found myself 10 times, maybe 100 times more affected by the arrangement. The style here is fine, nothing particularly special. There's some interesting ensemble staging in a few places, like Virginia's finale, which is hard to watch, but beautifully filmed. Let me mention a few miscellaneous things, I guess. I like the way that the school is portrayed in this movie. Yeah, it looks a bit corny, and the students look like adults, but I like how much of a madhouse it is, how little interest students have in participating in class. Reminds me of my public high school. I also think it's interesting that the title of this film comes from a poem read in class. In some ways, this puts some tension on the generational conflict that otherwise underpins the film. While the school seems largely to be an arbitrary place, this cauldron of stress and grief that stands in for the institutional norms of Kansas and the older generation. While older characters in this movie, including the teachers, they typically give bad advice and are not the ones to look up to. This poem is sort of rooted in that institution. This poem is one of the lasting ideas from the film, and it comes from the school. Now, you might debate whether we should take the meaning of this poem or the use of it here at face value, but either way, I think it's interesting that it comes from the school. There's a little bit of backspin on that. I was also kind of intrigued by the role of psychiatry in this movie. No surprise that the parents are skeptical about sending their kid off to some kind of sanatorium where Freudians might discuss sex or blame everything on said parents. But it is surprising, I guess, that the docs come off pretty well in this film. They don't really resort much to Freudianism, and they seem fairly wise about the world. They predict a few things that come to pass. It's debatable whether you would call this place an asylum, but if you do, there's somewhat limited set of films set in asylums where things don't go badly. Earlier on, asylums would have been tied so closely to this stigma around mental illness that they were usually horrifying places. Later on, they were maybe horrifying for other reasons, like their association with mainstream America. Think about One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, for instance. A very interesting history of the asylum in film. We won't get into it now, but apparently in 1961, in this movie, conditions were set for sort of a neutralish positive take, although it's debatable if that's a good thing or if it's really a positive take. But like I said, kind of interesting. Now, I've long said that one of my favorite things in movies is uncertainty. This movie delivers on that. I'm going to talk about the ending here, so look away now if you haven't seen this movie yet. Uncertainty and ambiguity, they're not the same thing. The ending of Splendor in the Grass is not ambiguous. It's clear what happens, but it is deeply uncertain. In some ways, this film has a very mature angle to it. Deanie shows up on Bud's farm where the oil derricks have been overgrown with plants. She's wearing a white dress and white gloves, perhaps a symbol of the purity that she's held onto through all these years. Bud is too dirty to hug her, or even to take her hand. Can't touch her at all. Now, maybe this is a tragedy, but maybe it's just a mature divergence between two people, with these two outfits representing a real schism in the interests and circumstances of Bud and Deanie. Since it's a classic movie and since it's a tearjerker, you might commit yourself to believing in their relationship at all costs, to believing in Bud and Deanie at all costs. It's love, after all, isn't it? It's a romance, after all, isn't it? But as we get closer to the end of the movie, you start to sense something that is in some ways more piercing, more dangerous, harder to think about than lovers being forced apart, which is lovers who drift apart, lovers who shouldn't come back together as brightly as some feelings might linger. So in some ways, this movie leaves things on a very mature note, which I like, this idea that they are rightfully going their separate ways. But as Deanie drives off, don't tell me that Bud is happy with the way things turned out. Don't tell me that things would have been better had they gone, or that things couldn't have been better had they gone another way. Bud and Deanie both admit that they don't think about their own happiness very much. Isn't that the tragedy of real life? And the sort of thing that a love story should never accept? Don't know. So, like I said, in some ways, it's got this very mature look. It's right there splitting, and that's a certain kind of heartbreak. But in other ways, it's not clear that that's the best. And there is a deep feeling of uncertainty throughout this movie. So I like it. Like I said, mature movie. I'll leave you with one piece of trivia, which is that the boat that Natalie Wood was on before she was drowned was called Splendor. And I don't know, I think there's one other angle in this movie is something about the passing of time, which in some ways is tied pretty deeply to a lot of movies about uncertainty, a lot of movies with these kinds of, and similar to The Arrangement, a movie where things start to go off the rails and you can't get back to where you were. You can't get back to the moments where it was good. That seems connected in some ways to some inevitable feeling of the passing of time and of a different kind of loss. And I think we get that in this movie too. It seems at first like the whole movie might take place within a month or two, but in fact it covered the span of a few years that ended up being totally consequential and transformative. Transformative for the better, for the worse, who knows, but that's life. And that's Splendor in the Grass. So, like I said, The Arrangement to me, order of magnitude more interesting and better, I think. Maybe not everyone will agree with that. Obviously, the ratings would suggest otherwise. If you haven't seen that movie, you should go check it out and my review of it. But Splendor in the Grass is pretty cool, too.